The Latin West has always had a robust intellectual tradition where rationality and scholarship are highly valued. There are many historical reasons for this: the juridical mindset of the ancient Romans, the precision and logic of the Latin language, and the influence of the early Latin church fathers, many of whom were lawyers, rhetoricians, or men of politics. Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine, and Gregory are the most eminent examples. Learnedness is deeply stamped upon Western Christianity, and people often speak of the rationalist or even legalist nature of Christianity in the West. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. The scholarly tradition of the West has kept Latin Christianity grounded in a healthy realism close to the actual nature of things, the actualities of human nature. The Western tradition is at its best when the aesthetic right brain of our art, culture, and mysticism is integrated harmoniously with the linear, analytical left brain aspects of our civilization. Today, however, an integral culture is but a distant memory. Christendom was sundered by the Reformation, revelation reviled by the Enlightenment, and piety shat upon by a debauched and impious modernity. The white light of a unified society has fragmented into a kaleidoscope of divergent forces, each pulling in its own direction. We now have a schism between left and right brain, between spirituality and doctrine, between law and grace. It's hard to think of any dichotomy our ancestors once maintained that has not been torn asunder. While it's often prior generations that are characterized as too cerebral or stodgy, I think it is our own day which suffers from a sterile textualism, an excessive emphasis on the letter torn apart from its larger context. Today's Catholicism is so intellectual, it's so focused on texts and talking, talking, talking. And the new Mass, of course, sacrifices ritual meaning in favor of endless explaining. We've come to accept that the right words, the right text, the right level of adherence to a document will solve our problems. And of course, with every passing year, papal documents increasingly become word salads devoid of substance. Now, this textualism can happen across all facets of the Christian life. It happens when we exalt the Aquinas who wrote the Summa, but forget the Aquinas who said it was all straw. When we think we must rationally explain every aspect of God's economy in order to accept it. It happens when we slip into treating the formulations of faith as if they themselves are the transcendent realities they express, or when we think there's a handy answer to every ethical dilemma that can be turned into a precept and stuffed into a moral theology manual. When we feel like we can't accept suffering unless we can understand it. It happens when we care more about jots and tittles than the care of souls. And it happens when we believe that official texts alone are capable of giving us the full picture of complex historical events. To this last point, let us use the Council of Nicaea as an example. The Council of Nicaea was a complex, multi layered event. It proved a turning point in settling the Arian crisis of the early 4th century, of course, but it also was a template for how the new Christian emperors would interact with the church. As the original ecumenical council, it was the church's first attempt at proposing universal legislation and enforcing a more or less uniform discipline across the Christian world, as well as settling the procedure for how ecumenical councils would be called and managed. And in the subject matter of the canons of Nicaea, we see a growing awareness of the transformation of society as the church attempted to grapple with its changed status, going from a persecuted minority to a powerful social force enjoying government patronage. There's really so much to consider here, but we are going to miss most of it if we focus narrowly on the official documents of Nicaea alone, to the neglect of all the circumstances and contexts in which those documents arose, and which cannot always be discerned from the council texts themselves. Now, you may be thinking, you're incorrect. If I want to know the teaching of Nicaea, All I need to do is read the text that formulates the teaching. All that other stuff, interesting as it is not strictly necessary. Now, this is true if your goal is to merely hear the teaching of Nicaea, but not if you want to understand Nicaea, because a council is distinct from the texts it promulgates. Or to put it another way, the council is not its texts. The council is the actual gathering of bishops which promulgates texts reflecting the beliefs and priorities of those bishops. The text expresses a teaching, but the council itself is an event. And if we truly want to understand Nicaea, we need to view it as an event so we can consider it holistically under all its various aspects. This is not to say there isn't a place for textual study of the council, certainly, but it is to say that studying the council's texts is not the same thing as understanding the council. And if we insist otherwise, we risk misunderstanding the council and, in turn, muddying the meaning of the very texts we are so intent on magnifying. After all, if the texts reflect the intentions, experiences, and beliefs of their authors, it stands to reason that we may consider these texts inaccurately if we fail to understand the intentions, experiences, and beliefs that led to their promulgation to begin with. Consider the famous 1302 bull of Pope Boniface VIII, Unam Sanctam, which famously taught the necessity of submission to the Roman pontiff. A proper understanding of this text requires a knowledge of the dispute between the Pope and King Philip IV of France, which occasioned it, in which Philip had argued that kings as a class were not subject to the Pope, compelling Boniface to declare that this was utterly false. But without understanding the background of this, it's easy to miss the fact that this bull is about the relation of the temporal to the spiritual order. A narrow focus on texts does not always reflect reality. Disciplinary legislation for the Middle Ages, for example, often reflects ideals and not what was actually going on. You can find papal decrees against bishops holding multiple benefices going back to 1215 and even earlier, but the practice endured until the Council of Trent and in some places even later. To take a more modern example, suppose someone in the future were studying the Second Vatican Council, and upon reading Sacrosanctum Concilium's passages about Latin and chant, concluded that Latin and chant must have been a regular facet of parish life in post conciliar parishes. After all, the document says they are to be preserved, and so they must have been, right? The text of Sacrosanctum Concilium alone would give no indication that, in fact, the opposite happened. Chant and Latin have all but disappeared from most Novus Ordo parishes. Reading the text alone without the historical context would yield not only an erroneous conclusion, but one diametrically opposed to reality. If we ever want to get down to understanding the Second Vatican Council, we have to move beyond narrow analysis of the documents. Now, I'm not saying the documents are irrelevant or that we can ignore the documents or anything like that. But I am saying that properly understanding what was going on from 1962 to 1965 requires more than textual analysis. Like Nicaea, Vatican II was a very complex historical event, and it needs to be studied as such. I've told the following story before on my blog, but years ago, when I was still a Reform of the Reform guy, I was giving a talk about preservation of tradition to a small audience that included a well known conservative theologian who today would be lumped in with the Where Peter Is crowd. He simply could not process this point of Vatican II as an event, and he kept shaking his head back and forth as if the proposition was causing him intense mental discomfort, repeating to himself as if a mantra, saying, "No, the documents matter. The documents matter." This always astonished me, as, of course, I'd never suggested that the documents don't matter. But for him, the very idea that we expand our view of the council beyond the documents alone, well, That would open up discussion to considerations of the Council Fathers' intentions, their beliefs, the influence of the 60s zeitgeist, and all sorts of things I'm sure a theologian wants to keep at arm's length. I also think this tendency towards textualism is behind the dominance of apologetics in contemporary Catholic discourse. Apologetics thrives on education, textual analysis, and point counterpoint argumentation. It's a highly intellectualized endeavor, well suited to a rationalist audience. Of course, apologetics has its place, but I've frequently seen apologetics exalted to the point where it functionally displaces catechesis, as if learning the faith and rationally defending it are identical endeavors. Care of souls, the common good, mysticism, prudence, ascesis, piety, reverence, and charity, which bindeth all things together in perfect harmony. We shall only enjoy an integrated experience of our faith when we can again infuse all these realities into our perception of it, healing the schism between the right brain and the left that has plagued our discourse for too long already.